Too much self-control looks impressive from the outside, but inside it often feels like living in a constant state of tension. A person who is overly self-controlled is always monitoring themselves, correcting themselves, and restraining impulses before they even have a chance to breathe. Life becomes less about experiencing and more about managing. Every emotion is filtered, every reaction is delayed, and every desire is questioned. Over time, this creates an invisible distance between the person and their own humanity. They may appear calm, disciplined, and unshakable, but that calm often hides exhaustion. Holding yourself together all the time is tiring, especially when you never allow yourself to fall apart even a little. When self-control becomes excessive, spontaneity starts to die. Joy usually arrives unplanned, but a highly self-controlled person struggles to let unplanned moments exist. They are always thinking ahead, calculating consequences, and weighing outcomes. Even happiness is evaluated before being allowed. This turns life into a series of decisions rather than experiences. The laughter that comes without warning, the excitement that breaks routine, the messy emotions that make memories meaningful, all of these feel risky to someone who values control above all else. Slowly, life loses color, not because bad things are happening, but because nothing is allowed to fully happen at all. Another painful side effect of too much self-control is emotional suppression. Instead of processing emotions, a person learns to push them down. Anger is swallowed, sadness is ignored, fear is silenced, and even love is restrained. On the surface, this looks like maturity, but inside those emotions don't disappear. They wait. Over time, suppressed emotions turn into numbness or sudden emotional breakdowns that seem to come out of nowhere. The person may not understand why they feel empty or why small things suddenly overwhelm them. The truth is, emotions demand to be felt, and control can delay them, but it can never erase them. Being overly self-controlled also damages relationships. Other people often feel a wall they can't cross. Vulnerability requires letting go, even briefly, and a person obsessed with control finds that extremely uncomfortable. They struggle to express needs, admit weaknesses, or show emotional dependency. As a result, relationships stay shallow or unbalanced. Friends may see them as distant, partners may feel shut out, and loved ones may sense that something important is missing. The person wants connection, but their fear of losing control keeps them emotionally guarded, creating loneliness even in the presence of others. There is also a deep identity cost to excessive self-control. When you are constantly controlling yourself, you stop asking who you truly are and start asking who you should be. Life becomes about discipline, productivity, and restraint rather than authenticity. Desires are labeled as distractions, emotions as inconveniences, and rest as weakness. Over time, the person loses touch with their inner voice. They no longer know what they want, only what they allow themselves to want. This creates a quiet confusion, a feeling of being successful on the outside, but disconnected on the inside. Ironically, too much self-control often comes from fear rather than strength. Fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of being judged, or fear of losing stability. Control becomes a shield against uncertainty. If everything is managed, nothing can go wrong, or so it seems. But life is unpredictable by nature, and no amount of control can remove that truth. When unexpected events happen, overly self-controlled people struggle more than others. They feel lost, anxious, and unprepared because their entire sense of safety was built on control, not adaptability. Living this way also makes rest feel impossible. Even when doing nothing, the mind stays active, monitoring behavior and productivity. Relaxation feels undeserved. Pleasure feels earned only after extreme discipline. This turns life into an endless performance where the person is both the actor and the strict director. Burnout becomes inevitable, not because the person is weak, but because no one can live under constant self-surveillance forever. The most tragic part is that people who are too self-controlled often believe this is the only way to be safe, respected, or successful. They don't realize that balance, not control, is what creates a fulfilling life. True strength includes knowing when to let go, when to feel deeply, and when to allow yourself to be human without correction. The problem with being too self-controlled is that, over time, control quietly replaces connection. You become very good at managing your reactions, filtering your words, and locking your emotions behind a calm face. On the outside, people admire your discipline. On the inside, you start feeling strangely distant from yourself. You don't explode, but you also don't fully feel. Life becomes something you manage instead of something you experience. When you are overly self-controlled, you rarely allow emotions to move freely. Anger is swallowed before it can speak. Sadness is rationalized before it can be felt. Joy is measured so it doesn't look excessive. You train yourself to stay composed in every situation, and eventually that composure turns into emotional stiffness. You don't break down, but you also don't open up. Everything stays contained, neat, and controlled, including your pain. People often confuse self-control with emotional maturity, but they are not the same thing. Emotional maturity allows feelings to exist without letting them destroy you. Excessive self-control doesn't allow feelings to exist at all. It pushes them down, labels them as inconvenient, and stores them somewhere deep inside. Over time, that emotional storage starts leaking through exhaustion, numbness, unexplained sadness, or a constant feeling of emptiness you can't quite explain. You become the person who never reacts, never complains, never needs anything. Others feel safe around you because you don't create emotional chaos. But that safety comes at a cost. No one checks on you. No one asks how you're really doing. People assume you're fine because you always look fine. Your strength becomes the reason your needs are ignored. Being too self-controlled also affects how you connect with others. Real intimacy requires emotional risk. It requires saying the wrong thing sometimes, feeling too much sometimes, losing control in small human ways. But when you're overly controlled, vulnerability feels dangerous. You'd rather stay composed than be seen as needy, emotional, or weak. So relationships stay polite, stable, and distant. You're present but not fully seen. Inside your own mind, control becomes exhausting. You are constantly monitoring yourself, your tone, your reactions, your thoughts. You don't let yourself spiral, but you also don't let yourself rest. There's always an inner supervisor watching, correcting, restraining. This creates a quiet form of burnout where nothing dramatic happens, yet everything feels heavy. You're tired, but you can't justify why. Sometimes being too self-controlled is a survival skill learned early in life. You learned that expressing emotions caused problems, so you adapted by staying calm. You learned that losing control wasn't safe, so you became disciplined. That adaptation may have protected you once, but in adulthood, it can turn into a prison. What once kept you safe now keeps you disconnected. The irony is that the more control you practice, the more out of touch you become with your inner world. You stop recognizing what you truly feel until it's overwhelming. Small emotions don't get acknowledged, so they pile up. And when they finally surface, they don't come gently, they come as numbness, anxiety, or sudden emotional crashes that seem to come out of nowhere. Being too self-controlled teaches you to endure, not to heal. You survive situations instead of processing them. You move on quickly, but you don't move forward. Everything unresolved stays inside, quietly shaping how you see yourself and the world. You may look stable, but inside, there's a constant pressure of unexpressed emotion waiting for release. And the hardest part is this: you don't feel allowed to stop being controlled. Letting go feels irresponsible. Expressing pain feels dramatic. Rest feels undeserved. You've built your identity around control, so loosening it feels like losing yourself. But in reality, balance doesn't mean losing control. It means allowing space for feeling without fear. Being human was never meant to be perfectly managed. Emotions are not problems to solve. They are experiences to be felt. True strength isn't about constant restraint. It's about knowing when to hold yourself together and when to let yourself soften. Too much control may look strong, but it slowly drains the life out of you. Being too self-controlled also slowly changes how you treat yourself. You become harshly self-disciplined, holding yourself to standards you would never demand from others. You don't forgive your mistakes easily because mistakes feel like a loss of control. You replay conversations in your head, wondering if you showed too much or revealed something you shouldn't have. Even when no one is judging you, you are judging yourself. Over time, this creates emotional loneliness, not because people aren't around, but because no one is allowed close enough to see the real you. You share facts, not feelings. You talk about events, not how they affected you. And when someone asks, "Are you okay?" you answer automatically, "Yeah, I'm fine," even when you don't know what fine actually feels like anymore. There's also a quiet grief that comes with too much self-control, the grief of missed moments. Moments where you wanted to laugh loudly but didn't. Moments where you wanted to cry but held it in. Moments where you wanted to speak honestly but chose silence instead. Each moment seems small, but together they add up to a life that feels muted, like the volume has been turned down on your own existence. Ironically, excessive control doesn't eliminate pain, it just delays it. Pain doesn't disappear because you ignore it. It waits. And the longer it waits, the heavier it becomes. That's why people who are extremely controlled often break down unexpectedly, not because they are weak, but because they have been strong for too long without release. Letting go of some control doesn't mean becoming reckless or unstable. It means allowing yourself to be human in safe, intentional ways. It means admitting when something hurts. It means allowing emotions to rise and fall instead of trapping them inside. Control is useful, but only when it serves life, not when it replaces it. True balance is learning when to hold on and when to loosen your grip, when to stay calm and when to let yourself feel, when to be strong for others and when to be honest with yourself. Because a life lived entirely under control may look successful from the outside, but inside it slowly starves the parts of you that needed expression, warmth, and understanding. As the habit of control deepens, you start confusing suppression with wisdom. You believe that staying silent is always smarter than speaking, that staying composed is always better than being honest. Slowly, you stop trusting your own emotions. If you feel anger, you question it. If you feel sadness, you minimize it. If you feel joy, you restrain it. Nothing is ever allowed to be fully real. Everything must be filtered, adjusted, controlled. This constant restraint disconnects you from intuition. Emotions are signals, but when you silence them repeatedly, you lose the ability to understand what your mind and body are trying to tell you. You stay in situations that drain you because you can tolerate them. You accept relationships that don't fulfill you because you can manage them. You convince yourself that endurance is the same as satisfaction, even when deep down you feel empty. Being too self-controlled also makes rest feel uncomfortable. Stillness becomes dangerous because when you slow down, feelings start surfacing. So you stay busy, productive, disciplined. You fill your time with structure so you don't have to face what you've been holding in. Control becomes your shield against self-reflection, even though self-reflection is what you actually need to heal. At some point, you may realize that your life feels emotionally flat. Nothing is terribly wrong, but nothing feels deeply right either. You're not miserable, but you're not alive in the way you once imagined. This is the quiet cost of too much control, a life that functions perfectly but feels internally disconnected. Learning to loosen control is not about chaos, it's about permission. Permission to feel without fixing. Permission to react without overthinking. Permission to be imperfect without self-punishment. When you allow emotions to exist, they don't overwhelm you, they pass through you. Control stops being a cage and becomes a tool again. The truth is, self-control should protect your well-being, not replace it. When control is balanced with expression, strength with softness, discipline with compassion, you don't lose stability, you gain depth. And depth is what turns a managed life into a meaningful one. As you move closer to the end of this realization, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Control was never meant to be permanent. It was meant to protect you during difficult phases, not define your entire personality. Somewhere along the way, what started as a survival skill turned into a way of living. You didn't choose it consciously. It grew quietly, rewarded by praise, by stability, by the absence of visible chaos. But a life without visible chaos can still be full of invisible tension. You carry it in your shoulders, in your jaw, in the way you hesitate before speaking. You carry it in how hard it is for you to relax fully, even in moments that are supposed to feel safe. Your body remembers what your mind keeps under control. There's a subtle sadness in realizing how much of yourself you've edited out to stay composed. Not because you were wrong, but because you were trying to be okay. You were trying to be reliable. You were trying to be strong. And in doing so, you learned to postpone your own emotional needs again and again, telling yourself you deal with them later. But later doesn't always come on its own. Sometimes it has to be chosen. The shift begins when you stop asking, "How do I stay in control?" and start asking, "What am I afraid would happen if I was?" That question opens doors you've kept locked for a long time. Behind it isn't destruction, it's truth, unprocessed feelings, unspoken needs, a version of you that's tired of being perfectly managed. You don't have to let go all at once. You don't have to become someone else. You only have to allow small moments of honesty, saying, "I'm not okay," without explaining it, feeling disappointed without justifying it, wanting something without immediately talking yourself out of it. These moments don't weaken you, they rebalance you. Eventually, you realize that control and freedom aren't opposites. Excess is the problem. Too little control creates chaos, but too much creates emptiness. The goal was never to master yourself into silence. It was to understand yourself enough to live fully. When you finally loosen your grip, you don't lose who you are. You recover parts of yourself you thought were gone. The warmth, the spontaneity, the emotional color. Life doesn't become harder, it becomes more real. And that's the quiet ending to this truth. Being too self-controlled sucks not because you're doing something wrong, but because you deserve more than just functioning. You deserve to feel, to connect, to exist without constantly monitoring yourself. Control can guide you, but it should never cage you. As this understanding settles in, another layer becomes clear. The world often rewards excessive self-control, which makes it even harder to recognize its damage. People admire how calm you are, how unbothered you seem, how little you react. They call you mature, grounded, strong. And each compliment quietly reinforces the idea that your restraint is who you should be. So you keep polishing that image, even when it no longer reflects how you feel inside. Over time, you stop knowing where performance ends and authenticity begins. You respond the right way instead of the honest way. You predict what's expected of you emotionally and deliver that, rather than allowing a real response to emerge. This doesn't feel like lying, it feels like being responsible. But responsibility without honesty slowly erodes intimacy, both with others and with yourself. This is why being too self-controlled can feel lonely even when you're surrounded by people. Connections stay safe, polite, manageable, but rarely deep. Vulnerability feels inefficient. Emotional risk feels unnecessary. You tell yourself that independence is strength, that needing less is better. Yet the human need to be seen doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It waits quietly unmet. There's also a hidden exhaustion that comes from constant self-monitoring. You're always checking yourself, your tone, your reactions, your thoughts. You replay conversations in your head, analyzing what you should or shouldn't have felt. Even when nothing goes wrong, you're tired not from life itself, but from managing yourself so tightly within it. Eventually, you may notice moments where the control slips without permission. Irritation comes out sharper than intended. Emotions surface at inconvenient times. Small disappointments feel heavier than they should. This isn't weakness, it's pressure leaking through. When feelings aren't allowed to move naturally, they find other exits. The hardest part is realizing that control promised safety but never promised fulfillment. It can keep you from falling apart, but it can't make you feel whole. Wholeness requires integration, allowing strength and softness, logic and emotion, discipline and desire to coexist without one dominating the others. Letting go, even slightly, can feel frightening because control has been your identity for so long. But release doesn't mean losing standards or direction. It means trusting yourself enough to feel without immediately correcting yourself. It means allowing life to touch you, not just pass through you under supervision. In the end, the problem isn't that you're capable of control, it's that you were never taught when to stop controlling. You were taught how to endure, not how to experience. And a life built only on endurance may last a long time, but it rarely feels deeply lived. That's why being too self-controlled sucks. Not because control is bad, but because you are more than something that needs to be managed. You are something that needs to be felt. As you keep living this way, you may begin to notice a strange contradiction. The more controlled you become, the less flexible you feel. Life changes, people change, circumstances shift, but you remain rigid, holding yourself to rules that once helped you survive but now limit your growth. What once felt like discipline slowly turns into emotional stiffness. You adapt on the surface, but inside you resist. And resistance, even quiet resistance, creates tension. You might also start confusing control with self-worth. On good days, when you're calm and composed, you feel proud of yourself. On bad days, when emotions slip through, you feel like you've failed. This creates a harsh internal standard where being human feels like a mistake. You don't just feel emotions, you judge yourself for having them. And that judgment hurts more than the emotion ever could. Because you're so good at managing yourself, others may lean on you without realizing the cost. You become the stable one, the rational one, the one who doesn't need much. People assume you're fine because you always look fine. And since asking for help feels like losing control, you rarely correct them. Slowly, you carry more than you should, not because you're forced to, but because you've trained everyone, including yourself, to believe you can. There's also a quiet grief that comes with this lifestyle, the grief of unlived reactions, the laughter you held back, the anger you swallowed, the honesty you edited. These moments don't disappear, they accumulate. And one day you may look back and realize you didn't fully inhabit your own life, you supervised it. Ironically, too much self-control can block real confidence. True confidence comes from knowing you can handle yourself even when things get messy. But when you avoid mess at all costs, you never build trust in your ability to recover. You rely on prevention instead of resilience. And resilience is what actually makes people strong. Letting yourself feel doesn't mean you'll fall apart. Most emotions are temporary when they're allowed to move. It's suppression that makes them heavy. Expression doesn't weaken control, it refines it. It teaches you when to hold steady and when to soften. It teaches you that strength isn't always quiet and calm isn't always healthy. At its core, being too self-controlled is a misunderstanding of safety. You learn to stay safe by staying contained. But safety without openness becomes isolation. Order without emotion becomes emptiness. Control without compassion becomes self-denial. A meaningful life isn't one where nothing spills. It's one where spills are cleaned with care instead of shame. Where emotions are welcomed as information, not threats. Where control exists, but it doesn't dominate. That balance is what turns survival into living. And until that balance is found, self-control, no matter how admirable it looks from the outside, will always feel a little suffocating on the inside. And as this pattern continues, something subtle but important shifts inside you. You begin to mistake numbness for peace. Because nothing feels overwhelming anymore, you assume you've achieved balance. But peace isn't the absence of intensity, it's the presence of alignment. Numbness feels quiet, but it's an empty quiet, not a restful one. It's the silence of emotions that were never allowed to finish speaking. You might notice that even joy feels muted. Achievements land softly. Compliments register intellectually but don't warm you. You tell yourself you're just not attached, just not reactive, just not needy. But deep down, there's a faint sense that something is missing, not pain, not chaos, just aliveness. Excessive self-control doesn't only suppress negative emotions, it flattens the positive ones too. This is especially confusing because you still function well. You meet deadlines. You stay consistent. You don't self-destruct. From the outside, everything looks fine, even admirable. From the inside, life feels slightly distant, like you're always watching it through glass. You're present but not immersed, involved but not surrendered. There's also a loss of spontaneity that comes with overcontrol. Every decision is filtered. Every impulse is evaluated. Nothing is allowed to simply happen. And while this protects you from regret, it also protects you from surprise. Some of the most meaningful moments in life aren't planned or optimized, they're stumbled into. Too much self-control quietly closes the door on those moments. At some point, you may realize that you don't fully trust yourself unless you're restrained. That without rules, discipline, and internal pressure, you fear you might unravel. This belief is rarely true, but it feels true because you've never tested the alternative. You've never let yourself be free enough to discover that you can feel deeply and still remain intact. Healing from excessive self-control doesn't look dramatic. It's small and uncomfortable. It's letting yourself say what you actually think instead of what sounds reasonable. It's admitting you're tired without justifying it. It's allowing disappointment to exist without immediately reframing it into a lesson. These moments feel wrong at first, almost irresponsible, because they break the identity you've built. But slowly something softens. You start to feel more connected, not because life is easier, but because you're no longer standing above it, managing it. You're inside it, feeling it, participating. The irony is that when you loosen control, you don't become weaker, you become more adaptable. You learn that emotions move on their own when they're respected. You learn that you don't need to dominate your inner world to survive it. You learn that strength isn't about tightness, it's about capacity. And that's the quiet truth most self-controlled people never hear. You don't need to be held together so tightly. You were never as fragile as you were taught to believe. Control kept you safe once, but safety is not the same as living. That's why being too self-controlled sucks, because at some point you stop living your life and start managing it. And a life that's only managed may be stable, but it will never feel fully yours. And as you sit with this truth a little longer, another realization begins to surface. You were never taught how to feel safely. You were taught how to behave acceptably, how to stay composed, how to stay useful, how to stay in control. So when emotions show up, you don't meet them with curiosity, you meet them with management. You try to fix them, quiet them, or outgrow them as quickly as possible. This is why emotions feel threatening instead of informative. Instead of asking what a feeling is trying to tell you, you immediately ask how to get rid of it. Sadness becomes something to overcome. Anger becomes something to suppress. Desire becomes something to discipline. Even happiness is moderated so it doesn't look careless or naive. You don't trust emotions to move on their own, so you try to control them before they take up space. But emotions don't need domination, they need acknowledgement. When they're allowed to exist, they soften. When they're controlled too tightly, they harden. That hardness is what eventually turns into numbness, bitterness, or quiet despair. Not because you're broken, but because you've been restraining a natural process for too long. You might also notice that your sense of time feels strange. Days pass efficiently, but they don't linger in memory. Nothing stands out strongly because everything is kept within bounds. Highs are lowered, lows are flattened. Life becomes even, predictable, manageable, and forgettable. Control makes time pass quickly, but it doesn't make it meaningful. At some point, you may start wondering why you feel tired even when nothing is wrong. Why rest doesn't refresh you. Why achievement doesn't satisfy you. The answer isn't that you need more discipline. It's that discipline has replaced presence. You've been so focused on holding yourself together that you forgot to actually be with yourself. Relearning how to feel is uncomfortable for someone who is overly self-controlled. It feels inefficient, messy, and risky. But slowly, it teaches you something important. Emotions are not emergencies. They rise, they peak, and they pass, especially when you don't trap them. You don't lose control by feeling, you gain understanding. And that understanding is what finally loosens the grip. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough to breathe, just enough to feel connected again. Just enough to remember that you are not a machine designed to function perfectly. You are a human meant to experience life fully. Being too self-controlled sucks because it keeps you safe at the cost of being alive. And at some point, safety alone is no longer enough. The last part brings everything together quietly and honestly, without drama, the kind of ending that stays with the listener. At the end of all this, what hurts most isn't that you were disciplined, controlled, or composed. What hurts is realizing how much of yourself you postponed, how often you told yourself later when it came to feeling, resting, expressing, or asking for support. You didn't deny yourself because you didn't care. You denied yourself because you believed control was love, safety, and responsibility all wrapped into one. But control was never meant to replace compassion, especially self-compassion. You were allowed to feel before you learned how to restrain. You were human before you became managed. Somewhere along the way, you started believing that being less expressive made you stronger, that needing less made you wiser, that enduring quietly made you valuable. And while those beliefs helped you survive, they were never meant to be permanent rules. A life lived entirely under control may look stable, but stability without softness becomes hollow. You don't need to abandon discipline to be alive. You don't need to lose control to feel deeply. You only need permission to respond instead of regulate, to feel instead of suppress, to exist without constantly supervising yourself. The goal was never to be unbreakable, it was to be whole. And wholeness comes when control finally learns to step back and trust you, not as something fragile that needs constant restraint, but as a human being capable of feeling, recovering, and continuing. That's why being too self-controlled sucks. Because you deserve more than just holding yourself together. You deserve to actually live inside your life.